The invitation arrived in a standard diplomatic packet, buried between a trade amendment and a new taxation proposal from the Dravosi Commerce Guild. It was not marked urgent. It was not marked important. It carried a small footnote at the bottom that read, "Developing civilizations, attendance optional." Humanity had received optional invitations before. They always showed up anyway. Admiral Sira Voss read the packet twice, set it down on her desk, and called her engineering chief, a broad-shouldered man named Hal, who arrived still wiping grease from his hands. She slid the document across the desk without a word. Hal read it, looked up, and said, "They want us to bring ships." "They want to laugh at our ships," Sira said. "There is a difference." Hal thought about it for a moment. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that meant something was already forming in his head. "How many can we bring?" "6. That is enough." Sira filed the acceptance notice the same afternoon. The sovereignty's diplomatic office responded within the hour. A brief, politely worded message that expressed surprise at humanity's confirmation and reminded them that the grand convergence was attended by the most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy, and that presentation standards were expected to reflect the host council's dignity. Sira wrote back one line, "We understand completely." The grand convergence was held once every 100 years at Verath Station, a structure so large it could swallow a moon and still have room for parking. It floated at the center of sovereignty space, ringed by observation galleries and diplomatic lounges and broadcast arrays that carried the event to every corner of the empire. Thousands of ships from over 200 species would gather, display their newest designs, and remind each other of the natural order of things. That order had not changed in 3,000 years. The Dravosi had the most elegant ships, long, tapered, almost translucent. The Thavians built theirs in perfect geometric forms, all light and angles. The Vorkai collective favored function, but their function was still beautiful. Energy flows made visible through the hull, pulsing like a living thing. Every ship in the sovereignty fleet was built on the same basic philosophy: precision, efficiency, and the elimination of unnecessary mass. Armor was unnecessary mass. Redundant systems were a sign of poor engineering. Physical projectile weapons had not been taken seriously for 1,000 years. Oru, the sovereignty's lead ship assessor, had reviewed humanity's military records as part of his preparation for the convergence. He had read exactly 4 pages before setting the file aside. Primitive, reactive, emotional. He had written a short internal report recommending humanity be given a courtesy slot at the end of the display schedule, after the serious civilizations had finished, and before the closing reception. That way, if their ships were as embarrassing as expected, the audience would at least be in a forgiving mood from the food. He sent the recommendation. It was approved without discussion. Sira's fleet left human space 3 weeks before the convergence. 6 vessels, each one wrapped in thick outer panels, modular shielding covers that were used during long-haul transport to protect hull surfaces from debris. From the outside, the ships looked like gray boxes. Enormous, ugly gray boxes with engine burns underneath. The first alien ship they passed on approach to Verath Station was a Thavian cruiser. Its crew watched the human vessels on their displays. One junior officer asked if humanity had sent cargo freighters by mistake. The senior officer did not reply because he was not entirely sure of the answer. At the staging coordinates, the 6 human ships were assigned the outer ring, the spots with the least visibility, farthest from the observation galleries, closest to the maintenance corridors. Sira accepted the assignment without complaint. Hal noted the position on his map and pointed out that the outer ring actually had the widest open space around it. "Room to spread out," he said. "Room to be seen," Sira said. The ships held position. The outer panels stayed sealed. Other delegations drifted past during the pre-event arrivals, their sleek vessels turning slowly to show off new hull configurations and glowing weapon arrays. A Dravosi ambassador's personal transport circled the human formation once and sent a brief transmission. Unusual hull configuration. Are those transport covers still attached? Sira replied through the comm without turning from her window. They come off tomorrow. Ah, said the Dravosi, a pause. Is that when they will look better? Different, Sira said. Definitely different. Oru arrived at Varath Station that evening and reviewed the day's staging report. He saw humanity's position on the outer ring, noted their sealed hulls, and marked them in his assessment log as the last entry. He wrote 2 words beside humanity's name that he had used before for other developing civilizations that had tried to impress the convergence and failed. Gracious dismissal. He poured himself a drink, looked out at the gathered fleet through the station's observation windows, and felt the comfortable certainty of a man who already knew how things would go. Somewhere on the outer ring, inside one of the gray boxes, Hal was reviewing the release sequence for the outer panels with his team. He ran the check 3 times. Everything was ready. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the engineering bay. You know they're all going to stare, one of his engineers said. Good, Hal said. That's the point. Outside, Varath Station hummed with 10,000 years of galactic pride. Inside the gray boxes, humanity waited for morning. The first 3 hours of the grand convergence went exactly as expected. The Dravosi unveiled a new escort-class vessel that could achieve transition speed in under 4 seconds. The crowd in the observation galleries responded with the low, resonant hum that passed for applause among a third of the species present. The Thavians displayed a geometric dreadnought that reconfigured its own hull shape mid-presentation, folding and unfolding like a slow mechanical flower. 2 junior ambassadors fainted from aesthetic overwhelm. The Volkai showed a ship so streamlined that light bent around its nose cone in a visible arc. Everything was beautiful, everything was elegant, everything weighed exactly as little as its engineers could manage. Then the outer ring lit up. There was no announcement, no presentation music. The 6 human vessels simply released their outer panels simultaneously, and the panels fell away in sections, great gray slabs tumbling slowly outward in the zero gravity of space, and what was underneath stopped the entire observation gallery into complete silence. The ships were wrong. Not broken, not damaged, just deeply, fundamentally wrong by every standard the sovereignty understood. They were thick. The hulls were layered in dense plating that overlapped like the scales of something ancient and large. There were angles everywhere, not the smooth angles of engineered aesthetics, but hard, functional corners designed to deflect rather than absorb. Long rails ran the length of each ship's dorsal surface, electromagnetic in design, clearly meant to accelerate physical objects at high velocity. Clustered near every major joint were smaller rotating weapons, point defense systems, dozens of them, each one independently mounted. Missile tubes were visible on the flanks, not hidden inside the hull but external, armored over with their own secondary plating. And the ships were heavy. Even at a distance, they looked heavy. The kind of heavy that does not move fast but does not stop either. Oru stood at the assessor's gallery window and said nothing for 11 seconds. This was notable because Oru had an opinion about everything and had never previously required more than 2 seconds to form one. Those are physical projectile systems, said the analyst beside him. I can see that, Oru said. And the armor plating, that is not structural material. That is dedicated impact armor. They built ships with dedicated impact armor. I can see that as well. Why would anyone? I intend to ask, Oru said. He sent a transmission to the human flagship and identified himself. Sira's voice came back calm and unhurried. Admiral Voss, he said, keeping his tone measured, your vessels are unconventional. Thank you, Sira said. Oru paused. That was not a compliment. I know, she said pleasantly. You can have one anyway. Oru straightened. He had not survived 40 years of sovereignty politics by losing composure over a junior civilization. Your armor design suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of modern energy weapon principles. Physical plating provides no meaningful defense against coherent beam weapons at standard fleet engagement ranges. Would you like to test that? Sira asked. The observation gallery went very quiet. Oru looked at his analyst. His analyst looked at the floor. Neither of them had expected the offer. A live demonstration, Sira continued, would be informative for everyone present. We brought one of our older patrol vessels specifically for this purpose. You may use whatever weapon system you consider appropriate. The challenge was too public to decline. Oru authorized the use of a standard sovereignty warship, a mid-class Dravosi vessel that had won awards for its weapons efficiency, and positioned it at a distance that any assessor would consider more than sufficient for complete hull destruction. The human patrol vessel held position. It did not maneuver, it simply waited. The Dravosi ship fired a full salvo, 3 coherent beam weapons at simultaneous discharge, the kind of combined strike that had ended the Kalvar uprising in under 6 minutes. The beams hit the human ship. They scattered, not deflected cleanly, not absorbed by shielding, scattered, fragmented across the angled hull plating, redistributed across the surface in a way that was geometrically brutal and entirely deliberate. A fraction of each beam found purchase. The rest went wide. The human patrol vessel continued moving forward at the same speed it had been traveling before the strike. A small section of outer plating on the port bow had darkened. Damage indicators in the observation gallery showed the strike had penetrated approximately 8% of the outer armor layer. 8% of the outermost layer of a ship they had called old. Dean, a Thavian council member who had been watching from the senior gallery, leaned toward the delegate beside him and said quietly, "How many layers does it have?" The delegate checked the sensor readings and looked up slowly. 14. Dean looked back at the human ship. It had not changed course. It had not slowed. The crew had not responded to the strike in any way that was visible from the outside, which meant either they had not felt it, or they had felt it and simply did not consider it worth reacting to. He was not sure which answer concerned him more. In the assessor's gallery, Oru was writing in his report. He crossed out the words gracious dismissal and sat for a moment with his pen above the page. Then he wrote 2 different words. He did not show them to his analyst. Outside, the human patrol vessel completed its slow pass of the observation gallery and turned back toward the outer ring, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had been hit before and had learned long ago that being hit was simply the beginning of the problem. The request came the next morning, formal, official, and worded politely enough that it could not be refused. The Grand Council of the Galactic Sovereignty wished to hear from Admiral Sira Voss directly, not a written report, not a technical summary passed through a diplomatic aide. Her, in the chamber, speaking out loud, in front of 40 senior council members representing the most powerful civilizations in known space. Sira arrived without a prepared speech. She brought Hal instead. The council chamber on Verath Station was a wide circular room with tiered seating and acoustics designed to make every voice sound important. Oru sat at the assessor's panel along the left wall. Dean was positioned near the center of the council arc. Pell, the lead engineer of the Voakai Collective, sat in the technical observer section with a data slate already open across his knees. Oru opened the session. Admiral Voss, the Sovereignty requests clarification regarding the design philosophy behind the vessels humanity displayed yesterday. Specifically, the Council wishes to understand the reasoning behind the level of physical redundancy, impact armor, and what appears to be a complete disregard for mass efficiency. Sierra looked around the room once. Then she said, "We build for the fight we might lose." Silence. Every ship design philosophy in the sovereignty, she continued, is built around winning. Fast, clean, decisive. Your vessels are optimized for engagements you expect to control. Ours are optimized for engagements that have already gone wrong. Dean leaned forward. That is an extraordinary assumption to build an entire fleet around. It is an assumption our history taught us we could not afford to skip, Sierra said. Hal set a data drive into the Council's central display system. What came up was not a ship schematic. It was a timeline. 3,000 years of it. The Council watched in the kind of silence that follows unexpected things. The timeline moved through centuries of human conflict, not the small border skirmishes the sovereignty had filed in their anthropological notes on humanity, but the full picture. Wars that reshaped continents, weapons built specifically to end civilization. Two separate occasions where the species came close enough to extinction that the recovery had taken generations. We have been at war with ourselves for most of our recorded history, Sierra said. Not always, but enough. And every time we built something and thought it was sufficient, something found a way through it. So we stopped building for the best case. We started building for the moment everything fails at once. Pell, who had not spoken yet, looked up from his data slate. The redundant power routing on your vessels is that standard across all hull classes. Every class above a scout, Hal said. 3 independent routing paths. If 2 go down, the third keeps weapons and life support running. And the point defense clusters, independently powered. Each one has its own microreactor. Pell wrote something. Oru watched him write it and said nothing. The armor layers, Dean said. 14, according to our sensors. Each one is a different material composite. Different density, different reflective index, different heat tolerance, Hal said. The idea is that whatever gets through the first layer hits a material it was not designed for. Whatever gets through that hits another one it was not designed for either. By layer 6 or 7, most energy weapons have lost coherence. That is an enormous amount of mass to carry, one of the Dravosi delegates said from the upper tier. His tone was not hostile, just genuinely confused. Your ships must be significantly slower. They are, Sierra said. Then how do you win engagements? By still being there, she said. Faster ships win the first exchange. Our ships survive the third. By the fourth, the faster ships are usually gone. The room sat with that. Oru cleared his throat. This philosophy assumes a prolonged engagement. The sovereignty has not fought a war lasting more than a few weeks in over 1,000 years. We know, Sierra said. That concerned us when we first reviewed your military history. Oru blinked. It concerned you. A civilization that has not fought a long war in 1,000 years, Sierra said, has not had to find out what happens when a short war does not end on schedule. She paused. We have found out, several times. Pell set his data slate face down on his knee. It was a small gesture, but it meant he was done taking notes and was now simply thinking. Dean said quietly, "You mentioned your species nearly reached extinction twice." "Twice that we have confirmed records for," Sierra said. "There may have been earlier events we no longer have documentation on. And after those events, you built ships like these." "After those events," Sierra said, "we built ships like these and we made a rule. Every ship must be survivable by a reduced crew. Every critical system must have a physical backup. Every hull must be able to take fire and keep moving long enough for the crew to make a decision." She looked around the chamber. "The decision is always the most important part. We do not build ships to win automatically. We build ships to give our people time to think." The chamber was quiet enough to hear the ventilation system. Pell picked his data slate back up. He had not actually been done taking notes. He had just needed a moment. The Voakai Collective filed the formal challenge request before the council session had even officially closed. It was not a declaration of hostility. The sovereignty did not permit those at the convergence. It was a technical challenge, a request to conduct standardized engineering stress tests on the human vessels under controlled and observed conditions, with full data transparency on both sides. The language was precise. The intentions were not entirely friendly. Pell had filed it himself, which surprised people, because Pell was generally considered one of the more measured minds in Volkai engineering leadership. But he had sat through Sierra's presentation and found himself in an unfamiliar position. He did not know if she was telling the truth, not because he thought she was lying, because the claims were large enough that he needed to see them himself before he could file them anywhere useful in his understanding of the universe. Sierra accepted the challenge the same hour. She brought 3 ships to the testing range: the patrol vessel that had taken the weapons strike the day before, a mid-class destroyer, and a heavy cruiser that was the newest design in the current human fleet. Volkai sent their own technical team to install monitoring equipment directly on the human hulls. Sierra permitted it without condition. That, more than anything else so far, made Pell uneasy. The first test was sustained fire absorption, a continuous beam weapon held against the target hull for 60 seconds. Standard sovereignty procedure considered 30 seconds of sustained fire on an unshielded hull a mission kill. The beam ran against the human patrol vessel's forward armor for the full 60 seconds. When it stopped, the outermost layer of plating had a long dark burn scar across it. Structural integrity beneath that layer showed no meaningful reduction. The Volkai team recalibrated the emitter and tried again. Same result. Pell noted the time of penetration depth at each 15-second interval and found the rate was not linear. The layers below the first were actually slowing the beam's penetration faster than expected. He wrote this down without comment. The second test was gravitational shear, a simulation of what happened to a ship caught near a collapsing mass point, which was one of the more common catastrophic failure scenarios in deep space engagement. Most ships had a tolerance threshold beyond which the hull began structural failure. The human destroyer went into the shear field and held. Pell's instruments showed microstress patterns forming across the outer hull but no propagation inward. He increased the shear by 20%. The destroyer groaned audibly through the monitoring feed but held. He increased it again. The hull began separation at one external sensor array. Automatic internal bulkheads sealed the section in 0.4 seconds. The rest of the ship continued to function. The Volkai engineer beside Pell said, "It sealed itself." "Redundant bulkhead system," said Hal, who was standing at the edge of the observation deck with his arms crossed. "The hull knows which sections to sacrifice." "The hull knows," the engineer repeated slowly. "The ship knows," Hal corrected. "The crew set the priority parameters. The ship executes them without input if response time falls below threshold." The engineer looked at Pell. Pell was already writing. The third test was electromagnetic pulse, a full-spectrum EMP at a range that would knock out most unshielded systems instantly. The human destroyer's external systems went dark, all of them simultaneously. Lights, sensors, communication arrays, visible weapons tracking. 11 seconds later, everything came back on. Not in a cascade restart, not in a slow system-by-system recovery, everything simultaneously. Pell checked the time. 11 seconds from full blackout to full operational status. He asked Hal how that was possible. "Faraday compartments around every core system," Hal said, "hardened independently. When the pulse passes, there is nothing to restart because nothing actually went down. What you saw go dark was the external array. That is the only component we allow to take the hit directly. It burns out and we replace it. Everything underneath was fine the whole time." Pell stopped writing. He looked at the destroyer. "You deliberately expose a component to protect the rest." "We call it a sacrificial array," Hal said. Takes about 4 minutes to replace in the field. That is, Pell did not finish the sentence. The final test was crew loss simulation, a scenario in which a ship was required to continue combat operations with a progressively reduced crew. The Sovereignty used this test to find a vessel's minimum operational threshold, below which it was classified non-functional. For most warships in the Empire, that threshold was around 40% crew presence. For the human heavy cruiser, Sierra's team removed crew members from the simulation one section at a time. The ship kept functioning at 30%, then 20, then 10. At 8% crew, 8%. A single human pilot named Ren sat in the primary control bay of a destroyer-class vessel and ran it alone for 6 hours. Weapons, navigation, damage response, life support management. 6 hours. When the simulation ended, Ren climbed out of the control seat, stretched his back, and asked if someone could bring him something to eat. The observation gallery had been silent for the last 2 hours. Pell sat down on a bench at the edge of the testing range. He had filled his data slate completely and had moved on to writing on the physical notepad he kept in his coat pocket, which he had not used in 11 years. He looked at the human heavy cruiser sitting at rest in the testing zone, scarred, dented in a few places from the day's tests, and entirely, completely operational. He thought about the Vorkai fleet, beautiful ships, efficient beyond anything humanity had built, minimum crew for maximum output, no wasted mass, no redundant systems because redundant systems meant redundant weight. He thought about what happened to a Vorkai ship when 40% of the crew were gone. He wrote one final note and underlined it twice. Then he stood up, walked to where Sierra was standing and said, "I would like to speak with your engineering team in detail, not as part of the challenge, personally." Sierra looked at him for a moment. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "bring your notepad." He looked down at the notepad already in his hand. "Yes," he said quietly, "I will." The emergency session of the Sovereignty's Inner Circle was called without public notice and held in a secured conference chamber 3 levels below Verath Station's main diplomatic floor. 11 people attended. No aides, no translators. Every member of the Inner Circle spoke the common tongue fluently, because being in the Inner Circle meant being fluent in things most people were not. Oru sat at one end of the table. He had not slept. The session was called to order by First Chair Meva, a Thavian of considerable age whose calm was famous across 7 systems, and who had once resolved a border war between the Dravosi and the Vorkai with 4 sentences. She sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at each person in the room before speaking. "What we have witnessed over the past 2 days," she said, "requires a response. I want to hear from everyone before we decide what that response is." The Dravosi representative went first. He was straightforward about it. Humanity's ships were a defensive breakthrough, not an offensive threat. Their vessels were slow. They did not appear to be built for territorial expansion. The armor and redundancy systems were impressive, but impressive did not mean dangerous. The Vorkai representative disagreed. She pointed out that the distinction between defensive and offensive capability was a matter of context. A ship that could not be stopped was not simply a defensive ship. It was a ship that could go wherever it chose and absorb whatever was thrown at it on the way. The Thavian military advisor said what several people in the room were already thinking. "We have modeled this. If humanity's current fleet engaged a sovereignty response force in sustained combat, our ships win the first engagement cleanly. The second engagement, we have an advantage. The third engagement," he paused. "The models become uncertain at the third engagement. By the fourth, if the human fleet is resupplied, our projections show significant sovereignty losses." "How significant?" Meva asked. "Above the threshold we have historically defined as unacceptable." The room was quiet. Oru had not spoken yet. Meva looked at him. He cleared his throat. I wrote them off, he said. I want to be direct about that. I reviewed their file, read 4 pages, and decided they were not worth serious assessment. I was wrong. He said the last 2 words without apparent difficulty, which was why, despite everything, he was still trusted in this room. What they have built is not what I would call advanced. Their energy systems are behind ours. Their speed is behind ours. Their sensor technology is mediocre at best. He paused. But none of that matters if the ship does not go down. He let that sit. A slower ship that absorbs 3 times the damage of a faster one is not an inferior ship in a prolonged engagement. It is a superior one. And prolonged engagements are the only kind of engagement where the outcome is genuinely uncertain. We have not fought one in 1,000 years. They have been fighting them against themselves for their entire recorded history. Meva turned to the group. The proposed responses. There were 3. The first was reclassification, moving humanity from developing civilization to strategic partner, opening formal military technology exchange talks, and beginning a longer assessment process. This was the measured option. The second was restriction, placing limits on humanity's ship production capacity through trade controls and resource access agreements, framed as a standard sovereignty economic framework applied to emerging civilizations. This was the quiet option. The third was what the Volkai representative called acceleration suppression, direct action to limit humanity's development before it reached a point the sovereignty could not manage. She did not use the word suppression in her formal proposal. She used the phrase managed development assistance. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. Meva asked for a preliminary vote. The results were not unanimous. They were not close to unanimous. The table was split in a way that suggested the conversation was going to continue long after the convergence ended. Dean was not in the room, he was not inner circle, but he had heard enough through his own channels to understand the shape of what was being discussed. He left the diplomatic floor that evening and found a quiet comm terminal in a maintenance corridor 3 sections away from his assigned quarters. He sent a short message to the human flagship. It was personal, not official. It asked Sira if she had a moment to speak privately. She responded in under a minute. They spoke for 11 minutes. Dean chose his words carefully, saying nothing that could be logged as a formal disclosure, but enough that anyone listening would understand what he was communicating. He told her the inner circle was divided. He told her there were people in that room who saw humanity not as a partner, but as a problem. He asked if she was concerned. Sira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dean, we have been reading inner circle communication patterns for the last 18 months. We did not know the specific content of what would be discussed here, but we knew a conversation like this one was coming." A long pause. "You knew," he said. "We have been in rooms like that one ourselves," she said. "We know what civilizations do when they encounter something they did not expect and cannot immediately categorize." Dean looked at the corridor wall for a moment. "What do you intend to do?" "Tomorrow," Sira said, "I am going to stand in front of every civilization present and tell them exactly what we came here to offer." Another pause. "We did not come to frighten anyone, Dean. That was never the point." "Then what was the point?" She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was steady and quiet, to be seen clearly, for once, not as primitive, not as a curiosity, not as something to be managed, a beat, as something real. Dean ended the call and stood in the maintenance corridor for a while before going back to his quarters. He thought about the inner circle session, about Oru's words, about the model that became uncertain at the third engagement. He thought about a species that had nearly ended itself twice, and had responded by building ships designed to keep people alive long enough to find another way. He was not sure if the sovereignty deserved what humanity was about to offer. He hoped they were wise enough to take it anyway. Sira had not asked for the final address slot. It had been given to her by Meva, who sent the invitation through official channels the morning after the Inner Circle session. No explanation was included, just a time, a room, and the words, full assembly, open floor, unrestricted. It was, as far as anyone could find in the historical record, the first time a developing civilization had been given an unrestricted address at the Grand Convergence in 3,000 years. Hal asked her that morning what she planned to say. She told him she would figure it out on the way to the podium. He had known her long enough not to argue with that. The full assembly chamber could hold representatives from all 212 member civilizations simultaneously. It was, when full, an overwhelming room, 1,000 different kinds of breathing, a dozen different methods of indicating attention, the low constant hum of translation systems running in 37 parallel streams. Sierra walked to the center platform, stood at the podium, and looked out at all of it for a moment before she spoke. "We did not come here to impress you," she said. The room settled instantly. "We came because you invited us, and we have a habit of showing up when we are invited, even when the invitation is not serious." A pause. "Especially then." There was a small sound from somewhere in the middle tiers, not laughter, something closer to recognition. "I have heard through channels that were not entirely official that some of you found our ships alarming. I understand that. They are not beautiful. They were not built to be. They were built by people who had spent a very long time learning what it costs when a ship stops working in the middle of a situation where stopping is not an option." She looked across the tiers. "We have paid that cost more times than I can stand to list in a single address." She did not look at notes. She had not brought any. "Every civilization in this room has a philosophy about war. Yours, from what we have studied, centers on decisiveness, end it fast, end it clean, minimize the duration and therefore minimize the damage. That is a wise philosophy. We have tried it ourselves. A beat. It works until the other side does not cooperate with the timeline." Dean, seated in the Thavian section, kept his eyes on her and did not move. "What happens then," Sierra continued, "is what we spent most of our history living through. The war extends. Resources run thin. The elegant systems fail because they were optimized for conditions that no longer exist. And then people make desperate decisions because the ship is going down and there is no time left to think." She let the silence hold for a moment. "We built ships to prevent that last part. Not the war, not the failure, the running out of time. If the ship keeps moving, the crew keeps thinking. If the crew keeps thinking, there is always one more option available." She looked out at the room. "That is the entire philosophy. 14 layers of armor and 3 backup power systems so that someone somewhere has time to find the option that ends it without more dying." Pell sat forward in his seat. "We are not here to sell you our ships," Sierra said. "We are not here to frighten your engineers or complicate your military assessments. We are here because we have something we built through centuries of being very bad at surviving and then getting better at it, and we believe it has value beyond our own hulls." She paused. "We want to share it." She nodded to Hal, who activated the display. What came up was not a weapon schematic. It was a framework document: survival systems, emergency hull protocols, crew redundancy architecture, cross-species life support compatibility models. 200 pages of engineering knowledge centered on one question: how do you keep people alive when everything is going wrong? "This is not a trade proposal," Sierra said. "There are no conditions attached. No territorial agreements, no resource access requirements, no seats on your council in exchange. We are offering this because we believe every ship in this room from every civilization present should have the chance to bring its crew home when the mission goes wrong. A beat. That is not a human interest. That is just a decent thing to want." The room was entirely still. Then Pell stood up. He did not ask for the floor. He simply stood, and because he was Pell and his reputation was what it was, the room waited to hear what he would say. "I second the proposal," he said, "and I would like to formally express on behalf of Voakai engineering leadership that what I have witnessed in the past 2 days has been the most significant engineering education I have received in 30 years." He paused. "We have much to learn. I intend to learn it." He sat down. A delegate from the outer system stood next, then 2 Dravosi engineers, then a Thavian junior council member who had not planned to speak at all, but found herself on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. One by one, the room filled with people rising. Oru was near the back of the assessor's section. He watched it happen slowly, methodically, the way he watched everything looking for the structure beneath the surface. He thought about his assessment log. He thought about the 2 words he had written, and then crossed out, and the 2 new words he had written instead, and still not shown anyone. He thought about a patrol vessel that had taken a full weapon salvo and kept moving. He stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. He did not speak. He simply rose from his chair and stayed there, which in Dravosi cultural convention meant something closer to "I was wrong, and I acknowledge it" than any spoken sentence could carry. Sierra saw him. She gave him the same slow nod he had given no one, the kind that passes between people who have understood something about each other without needing to discuss it. Meva called the session to close 20 minutes later. The formal vote on the survival systems exchange would be scheduled within the standard diplomatic cycle. It would pass. Everyone in the room already knew it would pass. Hal met Sierra at the base of the platform as the chamber began to empty. "How did you know it would go that way?" he asked. "I did not," she said. "I just knew what we were offering was real, and real things tend to land eventually." She looked back at the emptying tiers, even in rooms full of people who were not planning to listen. Outside the station, the 6 human ships sat on the outer ring, scarred in places, heavy, angular, deeply and deliberately imperfect. They looked exactly like what they were. Ships built not for the best day, but for the worst one. Ships built to keep the lights on long enough for someone to find a better answer. The galaxy had spent 3,000 years building beautiful vessels. It had taken humanity's ugly ones to remind them what ships were actually for.